February 17, 1943. Rechlin Experimental Airfield, Germany. Hans Vera Lescher's hands shook slightly as he made the first entry in his pilot log, documenting an occurrence that would profoundly reshape Luftwaffe perceptions of Allied aviation capabilities. From his vantage point inside the cockpit of a captured Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress designated DLXXC by German forces, Lescher examined the instrument panel with a mixture of disbelief and analytical scrutiny. The scale and sophistication of the aircraft defied all previous intelligence estimates. No nation, he reasoned, could feasibly produce such a complex bomber in large quantities while simultaneously sustaining a global conflict. The aircraft before him, a B-17F variant, was equipped with 13 defensive gun positions, each manned in combat formations by American crews. Lescher noted that the model he was examining carried 9 heavy-caliber machine guns, each capable of delivering 750 rounds per minute. Together, these weapons established a dense defensive perimeter, creating overlapping fields of fire that rendered the bomber far more resilient than anything the Luftwaffe had encountered. The capture of this intact bomber, later dubbed Wolfhound by its American crew, represented an unprecedented opportunity for German engineers and test pilots to study enemy technology firsthand. The intelligence value of this bomber far exceeded what could be gained from examining wreckage scattered across battlefields. While most Allied aircraft were recovered only in broken pieces, Wolfhound remained largely intact, offering complete insight into American construction methods, avionics, defensive systems, and operational design philosophy. The Luftwaffe's first practical encounter with a fully operational heavy bomber occurred 3 months earlier, on December 12, 1942. Lieutenant Paul Flickinger commanded the B-17F bearing serial number 41 24585, call sign PUB, during a bombing mission targeting railway facilities in Rouen-Sorteville, France, approximately 60 miles east of Paris. Stationed at RAF Molesworth in Huntingdonshire, England, Flickinger's unit belonged to the 361st Bombardment Squadron of the 303rd Bombardment Group. The bomber had been christened Wolfhound by the ground crew and marked with a distinctive nose art. Although the 303rd Bombardment Group, nicknamed Hell's Angels, had been exposed to combat only briefly, they were assigned 20 B-17 seconds for this particular sortie. German defenses, however, had other plans. Fighters from multiple Luftwaffe units, including Messerschmitt Bf 109 seconds and Focke-Wulf W 190 seconds, mounted aggressive intercepts. Their goal was to disrupt the bomber formation. Exploiting the relative vulnerability of stragglers, Wolfhound sustained severe damage during the engagement. One engine failed completely, while another lost partial power and emitted smoke from compromised cylinders. The bomber began falling behind its formation, leaving Flickinger with no viable option to return safely to England. Diverting to neutral Switzerland or Sweden was impossible, given the distance and the aircraft's deteriorating condition. The only realistic solution was an immediate landing within enemy-occupied territory. Through breaks in the clouds and smoke plumes trailing from the damaged engines, Flickinger identified a suitable hayfield near Melun, France. Demonstrating remarkable skill, he executed a wheels-up landing, allowing the 30-ton aircraft to come to a stop across mud and grass while minimizing crew casualties. All 10 crew members exited the plane and surrendered, unaware of the strategic significance their intact aircraft would hold for German intelligence. Within hours, Luftwaffe engineers and Wehrmacht personnel converged on the site. They meticulously documented every system, photographed structural elements, and examined the bomber's technology before any potential damage from curiosity or sabotage could occur. The intact B-17F represented a singular intelligence prize, a fully operational American heavy bomber available for study in its entirety. Recognizing the value of the capture, German recovery teams transported Wolfhound to Leeuwarden Airfield in the Netherlands, a key Luftwaffe base repurposed from a pre-war civil airport. The bomber's arrival marked the beginning of an intensive program to evaluate American aviation capabilities. German pilots and technicians would spend the following months dissecting every aspect of its design, from defensive armament layout to aerodynamic construction, gaining insights that would deeply influence Luftwaffe strategy and contribute to a growing understanding of the overwhelming industrial and technological resources of the United States. Transporting the captured aircraft demanded meticulous coordination to avoid further damage to the highly valuable asset. Just 2 days after its seizure, on December 14, 1942, German technicians completed temporary repairs to the battle-inflicted damage. The fuel tanks were refilled with high-octane aviation gasoline used by the Luftwaffe. American markings were removed and replaced with German insignia. Black crosses were painted on the wings, a swastika adorned the tail, and the bomber's surfaces were coated in the characteristic red and black colors, signaling its new ownership. For the ferry flight to Rechlin, a key Luftwaffe testing facility about 50 miles north of Berlin in Mecklenburg, 2 Messerschmitt Bf 110 heavy fighters escorted the plane. A specially selected German crew was assigned to fly the aircraft. The flight path was communicated to every Luftwaffe airfield and anti-aircraft unit along the route, accompanied by explicit instructions not to engage the captured bomber. Nevertheless, some units mistakenly fired upon it, causing minor additional damage before recognition signals halted the attack. This incident highlighted the Luftwaffe's instinctive drive to destroy American bombers on sight and underscored the difficulty of operational coordination within a military stretched across multiple fronts. Upon arrival at Rechlin, the aircraft entered a facility wholly dedicated to analyzing enemy aviation technology. Rechlin functioned as the central hub for testing and evaluating all captured Allied aircraft, paralleling the U.S. Army Air Force's Wright Field in Ohio or the British Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough. Every enemy plane that could be restored to flying condition was eventually sent here. German engineers meticulously examined each aircraft, identifying vulnerabilities and noting innovations to replicate or counter. The base employed hundreds of specialists, including engineers, technicians, test pilots, and support staff focused exclusively on understanding enemy aircraft performance and design. For 3 months after mid-December 1942, the bomber, codenamed Wolfhound, remained grounded while detailed inspections were carried out. Panels were removed to study structural frameworks, revealing the advanced stressed skin construction responsible for the B-17's remarkable durability. Measurements were taken of skin thickness, alloy composition, rivet patterns, and assembly techniques. Every system was documented extensively. The electrical network, with its extensive wiring, illustrated American approaches to integrating complex aircraft systems. Hydraulic mechanisms revealed sophisticated valve designs and pressure management strategies. The oxygen system demonstrated advanced understanding of high-altitude flight requirements. The intercom ensured reliable communication over engine noise, while the fuel management system allowed pilots to redistribute fuel to maintain balance and center of gravity. Engine synchronization features optimized performance while reducing pilot workload. Each component was carefully photographed, diagrammed in precise technical drawings, measured and compared with German equivalents. Luftwaffe engineers were particularly impressed by the industrial approach reflected in the B-17's construction. Unlike German aircraft, which relied heavily on skilled labor to hand-fit components, American bombers utilized standardized, interchangeable parts that could be assembled by semi-skilled workers using jigs, fixtures, and templates. This approach enabled rapid production and easy field repair. The design of the B-17 revealed an industrial philosophy fundamentally distinct from German practices. Where German production emphasized craftsmanship and labor-intensive processes, American manufacturing prioritized modular construction and mass production efficiency. The implications were staggering. A single captured bomber hinted at the enormous production capacity of American industry. When Luftwaffe analysts calculated potential output, the figures seemed almost unimaginable, yet conservative estimates indicated that the United States could produce bombers at a rate far beyond Germany's industrial capability. By studying Wolfhound, German engineers gained unprecedented insight into American design and manufacturing philosophy, offering lessons in durability, systems integration, and large-scale production efficiency that were otherwise inaccessible on the battlefield. The aircraft stood as a tangible testament to the strategic advantage inherent in the U.S. industrial machine, one that would prove decisive in the months and years to come. On March 17, 1943, the German Luftwaffe witnessed the first operational flight of the aircraft they had designated Wolfhound. The test flight was conducted by Flugzeugführer, a seasoned Luftwaffe pilot known for his precision and sound judgment, from the airfield at Rechlin. Despite its massive size, the bomber demonstrated unexpectedly smooth handling. Every control input was met with responsiveness that belied the plane's substantial weight. Reports from American aviators, which German intelligence had acquired through intercepted communications and prisoner debriefings, had previously praised the B-17's handling, and these observations were confirmed firsthand by German test crews. The aircraft exhibited remarkable stability throughout all phases of flight, whether empty at 15 tons or fully loaded at roughly 30 tons. Its controls remained balanced and intuitive, and even with one or two engines deliberately shut down during test maneuvers, the bomber stayed controllable. This characteristic explained why many B-17 seconds, despite suffering catastrophic combat damage, often managed to return safely to England, a feat far beyond the capabilities of contemporary German bombers. Over the following weeks of spring 1943, a series of structured evaluations were conducted by multiple Luftwaffe pilots. These tests were designed to explore every operational aspect of the Wolfhound, from low-speed handling to high-altitude performance. At altitudes exceeding 25,000 feet, where German anti-aircraft fire became progressively ineffective due to slower shell velocities and extended flight times, the aircraft remained capable and comfortable. Engine trials highlighted the sophistication of the Wolfhound's propulsion system. Its constant speed propellers, regulated by automated governors, reduced the pilot's workload while optimizing performance across diverse flight conditions. Formation flying exercises further revealed the bomber's ability to maintain stable flight in close proximity to other aircraft, a critical factor in the tightly packed combat box formations that American crews routinely employed. These formations had previously posed severe challenges for Luftwaffe interceptors, which struggled to approach without entering concentrated fields of defensive fire. Perhaps the most critical evaluations for German tactical planning focused on the Wolfhound's defensive armament. Understanding the B-17's weapons array became an immediate priority for Luftwaffe commanders, as it was crucial for determining the safest angles and distances from which fighters could engage. Each fighter pilot had to master the bomber's blind spots, the angles offering minimal risk, and the ranges at which German cannons could be effective without entering the lethal zone of American machine guns. The B-17F was outfitted with 950 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, arranged to cover nearly every potential attack vector. Later variants, particularly the B-17G, which would enter service in mid to late 1943, increased this number to 13 through the addition of a chin turret and reinforced nose armament. Even in its F configuration, however, the bomber's defensive firepower was vastly superior to any German bomber design. Typical Luftwaffe bombers, such as the Heinkel He-111, carried only 6 or 7 defensive guns, many of which were rifle-caliber 7.92mm weapons with limited stopping power. Fast bombers like the Junkers Ju-88 offered 4 or 5 defensive positions at most. In contrast, each 50 caliber round fired by the B-17 had enough energy to penetrate armor, destroy engines, shatter canopies, and kill crew members from distances exceeding 600 yards. The kinetic force of these rounds was approximately 3 times that of the German 7.92mm ammunition and roughly equivalent to 13mm heavy machine guns. Hans Vera Lehr emerged as the Luftwaffe's most experienced pilot of captured Allied aircraft, flying the Wolfhound extensively during the spring and summer of 1943. His post-war memoir, Luftwaffe Test Pilot, Evaluating Captured Allied Aircraft of World War II, provides detailed accounts of the B-17 and numerous other enemy planes. Lehr approached each captured aircraft with a methodical, analytical mindset rather than ideological bias. His combination of formal engineering education and years of flying experience ranging from gliders to powered aircraft made him exceptionally qualified to handle the perilous work of testing unfamiliar, sometimes dangerous aircraft. Through these evaluations, the Luftwaffe gained a comprehensive understanding of the B-17's flight characteristics, defensive strengths, and tactical implications. The insights derived from these tests directly informed German fighter tactics, yet also highlighted the formidable challenges presented by the bomber's design, a testament to the sophistication and resilience of American heavy bombers in the European theater. During the war, he piloted over 125 distinct aircraft models without experiencing a single major accident or sustaining significant damage, a record that spoke volumes about both his technical expertise and his disciplined, methodical approach to unfamiliar machines. When Leyes first took the controls of the captured bomber known as Wolfhound, he faced an entirely unknown cockpit. There were no manuals to guide him, no structured training program, no procedural checklist, and no experienced instructor to oversee his initial flights. Instead, he relied entirely on careful observation and trial-and-error experimentation. He scrutinized every control and instrument, made reasoned assumptions about their function, and tested these hypotheses cautiously at altitude, where errors would be survivable rather than immediately fatal. The bomber's instrumentation was a stark departure from German norms in both layout and underlying philosophy. American engineers favored a centralized panel with standardized gauge placements, consistent across different aircraft models, which simplified transitions for pilots. Electrical systems employed circuit breakers instead of fuses, allowing quick resets and easier troubleshooting. Hydraulic pressure readings were calibrated in pounds per square inch rather than the metric units familiar to German aviators. Even the throttle controls operated on reversed logic, pushing forward increased power rather than reducing it. Beyond these differences, what impressed Leyes most was the aircraft's durability and capacity to sustain damage while remaining airborne. The B-17 was built to endure punishment that would have crippled comparable German bombers. Its airframe, constructed from heavy-gauge aluminum alloy and employing stress skin techniques, distributed structural loads efficiently, giving the aircraft remarkable resilience. Redundant systems ensured that the failure of a single component rarely jeopardized the mission. Fuel tanks were self-sealing, a technology that minimized fire risk from small-caliber hits, something German engineers had recognized but never implemented as thoroughly. Critical crew positions, engines, and fuel systems were protected with armored plating. At the test facility in Rechlin, Leyes and his colleagues conducted extensive live-fire evaluations to assess the bomber's defensive capabilities from the perspective of attacking fighters. German pilots were placed in Messerschmitt Bf 109 seconds and Focke-Wulf W 190 seconds to simulate interception runs against a Wolfhound, flying either straight and level or performing evasive maneuvers. Ground observers recorded angles, ranges, closure speeds, and exposure times, while combat cameramen filmed the interactions from chase aircraft, producing instructional material for German squadrons across both Germany and occupied territories. The results challenged pre-war assumptions about bomber vulnerability. Conventional German tactics emphasized attacking from directly behind the bomber, a strategy that had proven effective against earlier, lightly armed Allied bombers. Against the B-17, however, this approach proved exceptionally hazardous. The tail gunner, seated in a powered Cheyenne turret with clear plexiglass panels, commanded an unobstructed field of fire within 30 degrees of the rear axis, leaving no blind spots. The dorsal turret, equipped with 50 caliber guns in a powered Sperry mount, could rotate rearward, effectively doubling the defensive firepower directed at a pursuing fighter. Even waist gunners positioned along the fuselage could target attackers approaching from behind, below, or slightly to the sides. A fighter pilot approaching directly from the rear faced at least 4 heavy machine guns on a predictable intercept path. The tail gunner alone could bring 2 weapons to bear, with the potential to inflict devastating damage if engagement occurred within the optimal range. Given the closing speeds of 150-200 mph between bomber and fighter, attackers typically had only 3 to 5 seconds to fire before veering away to avoid collision. During these fleeting moments, B-17 gunners unleashed a concentrated barrage, forming a lethal cone of fire. Luftwaffe combat reports documented numerous fighters damaged or destroyed during such rear attacks. Pilots who survived described the experience as entering a storm of tracers, capturing both the physical and psychological intensity of confronting concentrated defensive fire. Tracers comprising roughly 1 in every 4 or 5 rounds in American machine gun belts allowed gunners to visually track bullet paths while simultaneously creating a forbidding wall of fire that often compelled German pilots to break off attacks before reaching effective firing positions. Even attacking from below offered no significant advantage. The B-17's Sperry ball turrets positioned beneath the fuselage provided comprehensive coverage of the lower hemisphere. Its gunners, seated within a rotating sphere, used a mechanical computing site to calculate lead angles for engaging fast-moving aircraft, leaving no blind spots and maximizing defensive efficiency. Overall, the combination of robust construction, redundant systems, extensive armor, advanced self-sealing fuel technology, and strategically placed defensive gunners created an aircraft that not only survived heavy combat damage, but also imposed severe risks on any attacker attempting conventional interception tactics. These design choices and tactical lessons profoundly influenced both German evaluation and Allied operational strategy. The ball turret on a B-17 required the gunner to occupy an almost impossibly confined space, with knees pressed tightly to the chest and the face mask secured to the optical sight. Within this cramped compartment, the gunner could sweep targets across a full 360 degrees horizontally and nearly 90 degrees vertically, ranging from straight ahead to nearly beneath the aircraft. Enduring this position demanded immense physical resilience. There was no room for a parachute, movement was severely restricted, and the crewmen remained curled in a near-fetal posture for prolonged periods during missions lasting several hours. Despite the severe physical constraints, the ball turret's defensive capacity was formidable. Any aircraft approaching from below was almost guaranteed to enter its line of fire. German pilots learned this through costly encounters. Attempting an attack from beneath a formation of B-17 seconds meant facing synchronized bursts from multiple ball turrets, each tracking intruders with mechanical precision and engaging at optimal range. Side attacks were no less perilous. Waist gunners stationed in open panels along the fuselage endured sub-zero temperatures at high altitude, hurricane-strength winds streaming through open windows, and relentless engine noise that made coordination extremely difficult. The B-17F incorporated staggered waist gun positions to maximize coverage while preventing the gunners from obstructing each other. One gunner was positioned slightly forward on the port side, while another was slightly aft on the starboard side. Each operated a .50 caliber machine gun mounted on a flexible ring capable of wide traverse both horizontally and vertically. Assaults along the bomber's beam faced crossfire from both waist guns and the dorsal turret, which could rotate to engage targets at nearly any overhead angle. These overlapping fields of fire created zones of concentrated firepower, dramatically raising the probability of striking attacking fighters. As a result, German pilots were forced into high-speed, fleeting attacks rather than prolonged gun runs, limiting their accuracy and window of engagement. Combat analysis and Rechlin test programs concluded that the most effective method to intercept a B-17 involved frontal attacks from 12 high, approaching slightly above and ahead of the bomber. This strategy exploited the aircraft's most vulnerable sector, where fewer defensive guns could respond. Early B-17 variants, including the F model flown by Wolfhound, were equipped with only 2 or 3 flexible nose guns, operated by the bombardier and navigator crew members whose primary responsibilities lay elsewhere. These guns, mounted within the plexiglass nose, had limited traverse and required physical repositioning to track different angles. While the bombardier's view through the northern sight was excellent for precise bombing, the nose offered little defensive coverage, leaving frontal attacks comparatively unchallenged. A skilled German pilot could exploit this weakness. By diving slightly from above and ahead, firing a concentrated burst at the cockpit and forward fuselage, and then breaking away before defensive gunners could react, a fighter could achieve lethal results. This approach was pioneered by Hedman Egan Mir of Jagdgeschwader II in late 1942, just prior to Wolfhound's capture. Combat experience reinforced the fact that most B-17 defensive guns approaching head-on produce combined closure speeds exceeding 500 mph, as the fighter moved at 350-400 mph toward a bomber traveling 150-180 mph. This immense speed meant the nose gunner had mere seconds to aim and fire before the fighter passed. Successfully engaging a rapidly approaching aircraft demanded exceptional accuracy, mental focus, and composure under intense stress. In contrast, the attacking pilot enjoyed a steadily enlarging target in the windscreen, making lead calculations simpler than against lateral or crossing targets. When executed with skill, frontal assaults could yield remarkable results. Pilots mastering the technique sometimes downed multiple bombers on a single sortie. Yet the maneuver required nerves of steel and precise timing. Misjudgment could prove fatal. The high closing speeds kept collision risks ever present. Aggressive pursuit without timely withdrawal occasionally resulted in the fighter striking the bomber, killing both crews. Instances of multiple Luftwaffe fighters colliding with B-17 seconds during head-on engagements were recorded, underscoring the dangers involved. The B-17's rugged construction often allowed it to absorb severe forward damage and remain airborne. Unless critical hits destroyed the cockpit or disabled multiple engines simultaneously, the bomber could continue to its target even with the nose partially destroyed. This resilience meant German pilots had to destroy bombers decisively and quickly. Otherwise, damaged aircraft could return to England, be repaired, and rejoin future missions, rendering the attack only partially effective. Data from Rechlin test flights, combined with frontline reports from Luftwaffe units across Europe, generated a detailed understanding of the B-17's defensive capabilities. The findings were disseminated through tactical bulletins, training films, and intelligence reports, forming the basis for Luftwaffe attack doctrines against America's four-engine Flying Fortress. Despite having detailed intelligence on American bomber capabilities, German military planners derived little reassurance from this knowledge. Knowing the strengths of the enemy did not reduce them, and the United States continued to churn out heavily armed bombers at a pace far exceeding what the Luftwaffe could realistically intercept or destroy. Between May and early June 1943, the experimental bomber Wolfhound underwent extensive trials at Department E3 under the supervision of Otto Kuno. These evaluations included detailed measurements of engine performance across different altitudes, analyses of supercharger efficiency to determine optimal operating parameters, and comprehensive fuel consumption mapping, which produced charts to estimate operational range under varied conditions. All of these studies were designed to understand the capabilities of the bomber's four Cyclone Rhone 1820 radial engines, each delivering 1,200 horsepower at its rated altitude. Mounted in nose pods beneath and ahead of the wings, the combined 4,800 horsepower propelled the 30-ton aircraft to speeds approaching 300 mph at operational altitudes above 35,000 feet levels, at which standard German fighters struggled without specialized equipment. Intelligence assessments indicated that Boeing and its network of subcontractors were producing these advanced aircraft at rates 5 to 10 times higher than Germany's own heavy bomber output. Although initially staggering, these figures were corroborated through multiple intelligence channels, underscoring a harsh reality. If the United States could simultaneously manufacture long-range bombers, fighters, tanks, transport aircraft, and naval vessels on a global scale, Germany faced little hope of keeping pace. This industrial imbalance increasingly weighed on German strategists, illustrating that modern warfare had become as much a contest of production as a battle of tactics. On June 12, 1943, the Wolfhound was publicly displayed at an exhibition at Lürz airfield for Luftwaffe commanders and technical specialists. Alongside the captured B-17 sat other Allied aircraft that had been obtained through combat losses or forced landings. Among them was a B-24 Liberator, highlighting American approaches to heavy, long-range bombing from a distinct design perspective. A P-47 Thunderbolt illustrated the U.S. preference for rugged, heavily armed fighters over sheer maneuverability, while a P-51 Mustang showcased the emerging threat of long-range escort fighters accompanying bomber formations deep into German territory. AP-38 Lightning, with its twin-engine configuration, exemplified unconventional American design philosophies. British contributions were represented by an Avro Lancaster heavy bomber, a fast de Havilland Mosquito, a Hawker Typhoon specialized in ground attack roles, and multiple Spitfire variants that demonstrated the evolution of British fighter capabilities. The exhibition served several critical functions. Beyond training German personnel in aircraft recognition and identification to reduce the risk of friendly fire, it provided a first-hand look at captured technologies that might inspire adaptation or countermeasures. More importantly, the display delivered a stark demonstration of Allied industrial capacity and technical sophistication, which was rapidly outpacing German development in multiple fields. Officers who observed the exhibition were struck by the contrast in manufacturing quality. American aircraft components were engineered with precision and consistent tolerances, showcasing a level of assembly and quality control that German engineers could only admire. Smooth aerodynamic surfaces, meticulous fitting, and systematic construction methods exhibited signs of hurried or improvised assembly. Panels often required hand-fitting, repairs were made with non-standard materials, and overall finish and quality lagged behind American standards. The implication was clear even to those with limited technical expertise. German industry was struggling to sustain production of aging designs, while the Allies were delivering superior aircraft in overwhelming numbers. After its exhibition appearance, Wolfhound returned to Rechlin for a final phase of testing in preparation for operational deployment in July 1943. Engineers equipped the aircraft with a glider towing system to assess its potential in transport roles. This testing supported the DFS-230 combat glider program, which demanded powerful tow aircraft capable of lifting fully loaded gliders to operational altitudes. Between June 16 and early August, the bomber underwent a series of flights evaluating towing procedures, release mechanisms, and formation tactics, while gliders followed in trail. From a technical standpoint, the tests confirmed the aircraft's versatility and suitability for transport operations in addition to its primary bombing function. However, practical application remained severely limited. Germany's glider forces had been decimated in prior airborne operations, such as during the Battle of Crete, where student paratroopers suffered roughly 50% casualties. Across other theaters, airborne missions proved similarly costly. Combined with a chronic shortage of transport aircraft and dwindling fuel reserves, these tests offered limited operational benefit by 1943. In early autumn of 1943, the aircraft known as Wolfhound entered a new and far more secretive phase of its existence. After months of trials and evaluations at the Luftwaffe's experimental facilities in Rechlin, the bomber was reassigned from testing duties to active operational service. Its destination was one of the most shadowed formations within the German Air Force, a unit whose missions rarely appeared in official records and whose activities were deliberately obscured even from other Luftwaffe commands. This unit was Kampfgeschwader 200, based primarily at Rangsdorf Airfield near Berlin. Unlike conventional bomber or transport wings, Kilogramm 200 functioned as a special operations organization with an unusually broad and unconventional mandate. Its responsibilities extended far beyond standard combat roles. The unit conducted long-range reconnaissance flights deep into enemy territory, often using aircraft that could visually and electronically blend in with Allied formations. It was tasked with inserting and extracting intelligence operatives behind enemy lines, delivering supplies to German forces isolated by Allied advances or operating within partisan-controlled regions, and evaluating experimental aircraft and weapons systems considered too sensitive for ordinary test units. To fulfill such diverse missions, Kilogramm 200 did not rely on standardized aircraft types or simplified logistics. Instead, it operated a highly varied collection of German-built and captured Allied aircraft, each selected for its specific suitability to a particular task. Alongside Luftwaffe machines such as the Ju-290 long-range transport, the Heinkel He-111 medium bomber, and the armored STKFCs. 232 transport aircraft, the unit also flew seized Soviet aircraft for operations on the Eastern Front. Even more remarkably, Kilogram 200 incorporated several captured American bombers into its inventory for missions in Western Europe and the Mediterranean theater. Among these, the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress proved especially valuable. With a combat radius exceeding 2,000 miles, a service ceiling above 25,000 feet, a standard foreign aircraft imposed significant logistical challenges. The operational advantages often outweighed the costs. Flying captured American bombers into Allied deck-controlled airspace created opportunities that German aircraft could not easily replicate. During night operations or in poor weather, Allied radar operators and fighter controllers might misidentify a lone B-17 as a friendly aircraft returning from a bombing mission over Europe. Such confusion could allow the intruder to penetrate defended airspace without immediate interception, sometimes gaining critical minutes or even hours before defensive measures were fully activated. In the context of covert missions, that time margin could determine success or failure. Even in daylight conditions, a B-17 cruising at high altitude could, under certain circumstances, approach or briefly merge with American bomber formations. From these vantage points, German crews were able to observe Allied flight tactics, formation discipline, radio procedures, and defensive reactions firsthand, gathering intelligence that was otherwise extremely difficult to obtain. Following its arrival at Rangsdorf, Wolfhound underwent another transformation. The aircraft received a new camouflage scheme optimized for nocturnal operations over enemy territory. Dark blue-gray tones replaced the earlier experimental paint patterns that had featured yellow undersurfaces and mottled green finishes. Standard Kilogram 200 identification codes beginning with a 3+ were applied to both sides of the fuselage. These markings ensured recognition by German forces while deliberately revealing little about the aircraft's precise role or assignment. Surviving records suggest that the bomber ultimately carried the code A3+AE, though some historians believe it may have flown under different identifiers depending on the mission and security requirements. Precise documentation of Wolfhound's operational history within Kilogram 200 has largely vanished. Wartime records were destroyed during the final months of the conflict, dispersed among collapsing archives, or never created at all due to the clandestine nature of special operations. In some cases, surviving participants intentionally withheld details during the post-war years when certain missions remained classified or politically sensitive for decades. Despite these gaps, post-war research by aviation historians has established that Kilogram 200 operated at least 4 captured B-17s between late 1943 and mid-1944, with some evidence suggesting these aircraft conducted missions across Europe, the Mediterranean basin, the Middle East, and North Africa, often in regions where intelligence stakes were exceptionally high. Some operations were relatively straightforward, involving the transport of critical personnel, equipment, or documents to isolated German garrisons that had been cut off by Allied advances or were operating covertly behind enemy lines. Other missions were far more complex. Intelligence agents were inserted into Allied deck-controlled territory via nighttime parachute drops or high-altitude bailouts designed to conceal the true destination of the aircraft. Reconnaissance flights photographed ports where invasion fleets might assemble, airfields hosting concentrated bomber forces, and supply depots whose activity hinted at future Allied offensives. The most sensitive of these missions remain unexplained even today, their details lost with the men who carried them out. Hans Werner Lerche, a prominent Luftwaffe test pilot, later flew other captured B-17s that arrived at Rechlin after Wolfhound transitioned into frontline special operations service. One such aircraft was B-17F serial number 42-30336, known to its American crew as Miss Nonny II. On October 9, 1943, during a mission over Germany, the bomber suffered engine problems and was forced to divert. Over Denmark, most of the crew bailed out, but the pilot elected to remain with the aircraft and succeeded in bringing it down in a controlled crash landing at Norholm Estate near Vard. The aircraft came to rest largely intact, a striking demonstration of the Flying Fortress's stable handling characteristics even under emergency conditions. German recovery units arrived quickly, fully aware of the intelligence value such a prize represented. Lerch himself later flew the captured bomber out of the field to Esbjerg airfield and then onward to Rechlin for detailed examination. That he was able to do so without an instruction manual, formal training, or a prior familiarization flight underscored both his exceptional piloting skill and the forgiving nature of the B-17's design. Reassigned the German identification code 7+8, Miss Nonny II remained in evaluation service for an extended period. Records indicate that it was still flying test missions as late as December 1944. Each captured flying fortress offered German engineers a rare opportunity to study American aircraft production in detail. Different manufacturing blocks were compared to identify structural changes, potential weaknesses, and incremental improvements that might require adjustments in German interception tactics. Extensive weapons testing was also conducted. Engineers fired a variety of German ammunition types at representative sections of B-17 structure to determine optimal attack angles and engagement ranges for fighter pilots. These trials revealed that standard 20mm cannon fire was only marginally effective against the bomber's reinforced structure and self-sealing fuel tanks. In contrast, hits achieved with 30mm cannon rounds were found to be devastating, often causing catastrophic damage when contact was made. Through aircraft like Wolfhound and Miss Nonny II, Kilogram 200 gained insights that extended far beyond individual missions. Knowledge that shaped German understanding of Allied air power during the most intense years of the air war over Europe. Extensive testing and evaluation of the B-17 bomber during 1943 produced an unparalleled understanding of the aircraft's capabilities, revealing a platform that represented the zenith of American heavy bomber design at that point in the war. Beyond sheer structural and aerodynamic refinement, the aircraft's defensive armament was so formidable that it fundamentally reshaped the strategies of daylight bombing over Europe. German test pilots at Rechlin meticulously calculated the defensive potential of the B-17G, the final iteration that entered service in mid-1943. This version was outfitted with 13 Browning M250 caliber machine guns, strategically distributed to ensure near-total coverage of all attack vectors. Each gun fired standard D50 BMG rounds at a cyclic rate of 750 to 800 rounds per minute. In practical operation, gunners could sustain continuous fire for several minutes, constrained primarily by the finite ammunition carried and barrel heating, which demanded careful attention to prevent overheating. A fully loaded B-17G carried approximately 7,500 rounds across its multiple gun stations. Ammunition distribution was carefully calculated to balance weight with defensive efficacy. The tail turret alone held 500 rounds per gun, totaling 1,000 rounds, sufficient to repel persistent attacks from pursuing fighters. The top dorsal turret carried comparable amounts, enabling sustained engagement from above. Even the cramped bore turret contained between 250 and 500 rounds per gun, depending on mission duration and the gunner's physical capacity, while the waist guns had 600. 800 rounds each, and the nose and chin positions mirrored this allocation to ensure coverage throughout the flight. When German analysts calculated the combined rate of fire from a fully armed B-17G, the results were striking. All 13 guns firing simultaneously could produce nearly 10,000 rounds per minute. In more intuitive terms, this translated to roughly 160 bullets being discharged every second, forming a dense, lethal cone of fire along the bomber's approach path. Yet, these aircraft rarely operated in isolation. The concept of American daylight strategic bombing, honed before the war and refined through the costly campaigns of 1942, 1943, relied heavily on formation flying. Multiple bombers operating in coordinated arrays provided overlapping fields of fire, creating zones of near-impenetrable defensive coverage. The combat box formation, developed by Colonel Curtis LeMay and adjusted through combat experience, organized aircraft in tight three-dimensional patterns. A typical squadron element included 3 bombers in close formation, arranged in V or echelon patterns based on tactical needs. 3 such elements, offset horizontally and stacked vertically, formed a squadron box of 9 aircraft. Combining 3 squadron boxes produced a group box of 27 bombers, although some groups included an additional squadron totaling 36 planes. Within a typical 3-squadron group box, even if each aircraft carried only 9 guns rather than the full 13, the collective defensive firepower exceeded 180 heavy machine guns. This interlocking fire created overlapping protective zones, which scaled exponentially at higher organizational levels. 3 groups operating together could form a wing box of 54 to 81 aircraft, collectively wielding 700 machine guns, establishing a network of fire that forced enemy pilots to confront concentrated resistance from dozens of bombers simultaneously. German fighter pilots described these formations as a wall of tracers, vividly capturing both the visual intensity and psychological pressure of mass defensive fire. At combat ranges of 400 to 800 yards, any detected threat prompted virtually every gunner to open fire, resulting in a spectacularly dense barrage of projectiles. A single fighter passing head-on through a formation could face simultaneous fire from 50 or more guns, each gunner attempting to track and engage the target at maximum rate. While the probability of any individual round hitting its target remained limited due to the challenges of lead calculation, range judgment, and fleeting engagement windows, the sheer volume of fire and the psychological stress imposed on attackers was profound. After-action reports from the Luftwaffe documented numerous instances where fighters aborted attacks before reaching optimal firing range, unable to force themselves through the overlapping streams of tracer fire. Those pilots who persisted and engaged directly faced a daunting arithmetic. Studies based on combat data indicated that eliminating a B-17 from the rear required approximately 20 hits from 20mm cannon shells, assuming that those hits were well distributed across the aircraft's critical systems rather than concentrated on a single vulnerability. This combination of volume fire, careful formation tactics, and robust aircraft design made daylight raids by American bombers a uniquely lethal challenge for the Luftwaffe, setting a new standard for defensive air power in the conflict. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress earned its reputation not through myth, but through engineering. Its airframe was deliberately overbuilt, critical systems were duplicated to reduce single-point failures, and its fuel tanks were designed to seal themselves after being punctured. These features allowed the bomber to remain airborne even after sustaining damage that would have destroyed less robust aircraft. Crews routinely returned from missions with engines shot out, control surfaces shredded, and fuselages riddled with holes. Against such resilience, German fighter pilots faced harsh mathematical realities. Analysis conducted after the war based on gun camera film and records of ammunition consumption showed that fighter pilots firing at maneuvering bombers from typical combat distances achieved hit rates of roughly 2%. This meant that only about 2 out of every 100 rounds fired actually struck the target. Translated into practical terms, destroying a single B-17 from a rear approach required approximately 20 effective hits with 20mm cannon shells. Achieving those hits statistically demanded the expenditure of around 1,000 rounds. Early versions of the Focke-Wulf W190 were simply not equipped for that task. These fighters carried 2 20mm cannons fed by drum magazines, each holding 250 rounds, for a total of 500 rounds, only half of what was theoretically needed for a single confirmed kill. Later upgrades replaced the drums with belt-fed systems and added additional cannons, increasing firepower. Even so, total ammunition capacity typically rose only to about 600 rounds across all guns. This still left pilots with enough ammunition for 1, at best 2, sustained firing passes before their guns fell silent. Once empty, what pilots called running Winchester, they had no choice but to disengage and return to base. The bombers, by contrast, were armed for endurance. Each B-17 carried thousands of rounds of 50 caliber ammunition distributed among multiple defensive gun stations. As long as enemy aircraft were detected, the bombers could continue firing for extended periods. While individual gunners faced enormous challenges, high closure speeds, extreme ranges, and complex deflection angles, the collective volume of fire from an entire bomber formation made hits increasingly likely. When dozens of aircraft focused their defensive fire on a single attacker, probability alone worked against the fighter. By 1943, this imbalance began to show in the Luftwaffe's loss rates. American bomber formations grew larger and appeared over Germany with increasing frequency. German fighter units, meanwhile, found themselves unable to replace experienced pilots as quickly as combat losses and training accidents removed them from the roster. To counter the bombers, German tacticians emphasized frontal attacks. Approaching from ahead reduced exposure to the densest defensive fire and increased the chance of damaging vital components in the cockpit or engines. For expert pilots, this method offered better odds of success, but it came at a steep cost in difficulty and risk. A head-on interception meant closure speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, with both aircraft flying at maximum velocity toward one another. At that speed, the visual picture of the target changed almost continuously. The pilot had only seconds to judge distance, adjust aim, and decide when to fire. Opening fire too early scattered shells harmlessly through empty air. Waiting too long risked catastrophic collision. The effective firing window lasted perhaps 2 seconds, spanning the range from roughly 400 yards down to 100 yards. Within that fleeting moment, the pilot had to account for his own aircraft's motion, anticipate the bomber's subtle evasive maneuvers, fire controlled bursts while correcting aim, and initiate a breakaway maneuver in time to avoid impact. Mastery of this sequence required intense training and extensive combat experience, qualities increasingly rare as the war progressed. One unusual opportunity helped refine German tactics. A captured B-17, recovered largely intact at Rechlin, was made available for study. Fighter pilots and engineers examined the aircraft in exhaustive detail. They walked around it, analyzing armor placement and gun coverage. They climbed inside, crawling through the narrow fuselage and observing the cramped, exhausting conditions in which bomber crews operated. Pilots sat in every gun position, including the ball turret, testing how far each mount could rotate and elevate. They carefully mapped overlapping fields of fire and identified blind spots, angles where a fighter might briefly avoid defensive guns. Training flights followed, with fighters practicing attack approaches while the bomber performed evasive maneuvers, turning theoretical knowledge into practical skill. For veteran pilots, this hands-on familiarity proved invaluable. It allowed them to exploit weaknesses that were nearly impossible to recognize amid the chaos of combat, but such expertise could not be taught quickly. By late 1943, the Luftwaffe was losing its most seasoned aviators faster than replacement programs could produce equally capable pilots. Newly trained flyers, often with minimal flight hours, struggled under combat pressure. Many aborted attacks too soon, wasting precious ammunition. Others pressed too hard, misjudging closure speed and colliding with their targets. Situational awareness, so critical in high-speed engagements, was often lacking. At the same time, American engineers were learning just as quickly. Combat reports and crew feedback drove continuous improvements to bomber design. The B-17G, introduced in the latter half of 1943, incorporated one of the most significant upgrades yet: a powered chin turret mounted beneath the nose. Operated remotely by the bombardier using a computing gun sight, this turret housed twin 50-caliber machine guns capable of engaging targets directly ahead. This addition dramatically strengthened the bomber's frontal defense. Fighters approaching head-on were now tracked from long range, with concentrated fire directed along their predicted flight path. The very tactic that had once offered German aces their best chance suddenly became far more lethal. As a result, the balance continued to shift. The flying fortress, already difficult to destroy, grew even more dangerous to attack. While the Luftwaffe faced dwindling experience, shrinking margins for error, and a sky that was becoming increasingly hostile. Alongside the defensive guns mounted on the B-17G's sides, which were manned by the bombardier and navigator, and the versatile top turret capable of swinging forward, the aircraft could deliver 6 to 8 heavy machine guns in a frontal defensive arc. This arrangement created a lethal zone that made frontal attacks extremely hazardous, compelling the Luftwaffe to constantly refine their attack tactics. German pilots soon adapted by striking from elevated angles, diving steeply from above where the B-17's forward-firing guns could not elevate enough to engage effectively. Others attempted assaults from beneath the nose, seeking to exploit the limited depression range of the chin turret while staying clear of the ball turret below. A third approach involved engaging from a distance, firing unguided rockets at bomber formations, relying on sheer luck or near misses to inflict damage or to trigger collisions within tightly packed groups of bombers. Among these standoff weapons, the Werfer 21 rocket gained particular popularity. Mounted under the wings in tubular launchers, these rockets carried high-explosive warheads designed to scatter bomber formations via blast effects rather than precision strikes. Despite their impressive destructive potential, the rockets were notoriously inaccurate and heavy, impairing the maneuverability of the launching fighter. Beyond 800 yards, hits were rare, and the added drag made fighters vulnerable to the long-range Allied escort fighters, such as the P-51 Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt, which by 1944 were capable of accompanying bombers deep into German territory, stripping away the sanctuary German pilots had previously relied upon. The aerial arms race escalated throughout 1943 and 1944. German engineers introduced increasingly powerful cannons, including the 30mm Mk108, developed larger rockets with better guidance systems, and even experimented with fighter-deployed bombs aimed at bomber formations. Meanwhile, American forces enhanced the B-17G's defensive firepower, refined formation flying through combat experience, and deployed long-range escort fighters with superior performance, steadily closing the gap between offense and defense. Yet, all tactical adjustments could not overcome a fundamental strategic reality. The United States' industrial output vastly outpaced that of Germany. Each B-17 lost over Europe might mark a tactical success for a Luftwaffe pilot, but it did not significantly disrupt the strategic bombing campaign. Within days or sometimes weeks, a new bomber, straight from Boeing's Seattle plant, Douglas facilities in Long Beach, or Vega's Burbank operations, would arrive in England fully equipped and crewed, ready to resume operations. Production figures starkly illustrated this imbalance. Between 1935 and 1945, American factories produced 12,731 B-17 seconds, with the majority built during the peak war years of 1943 to 1945. Boeing alone manufactured 6,981 units across all variants in Seattle. Douglas contributed 3,000 aircraft from Long Beach, and Vega produced 2,750 in Burbank. At the height of production in 1944, Boeing was assembling roughly 362 bombers per month, more than 12 per day from a single plant, a pace that stunned German intelligence. By comparison, Germany's heavy bomber output was minuscule. Behind He-177, the only operational four-engine heavy bomber, suffered from chronic engine fires due to its coupled engine layout and frequent mechanical failures. Between 1942 and 1944, total production barely exceeded 1,100 units, and many Luftwaffe squadrons often rejected the type in favor of twin-engine medium bombers despite their inferior range and payload. The German pilots' morale suffered when confronted with these stark numbers. Knowing that the destruction of a single B-17 could be replaced within days, many questioned the value of risking their lives in combat. Strategic intelligence briefings emphasized the overwhelming scale of the opposition, underlining the futility of individual tactical victories in the broader war effort. Captured B-17 seconds, such as the one examined at Rechlin, offered German engineers unprecedented insight into American manufacturing practices. They observed a highly modular production system where subassemblies from different factories could be seamlessly integrated during final assembly. Standardized components sourced from hundreds of suppliers created a nationwide supply chain of extraordinary complexity and efficiency. Simplified assembly procedures allowed semi-skilled laborers, many of them women newly entering industrial work, to construct sophisticated bombers far faster than highly trained German craftsmen could, using traditional methods. The B-17's significance extended beyond its engineering ingenuity. It embodied a comprehensive industrial philosophy, prioritizing mass production over artisanal perfection, relying on interchangeable parts instead of bespoke fittings, and favoring adequate performance across large quantities rather than flawless quality in limited numbers. This approach ensured that American air power could sustain losses and continue the bombing campaign unabated, a reality that German planners could neither prevent nor match. Every aspect of the B-17's design reflected a deliberate strategy to maximize efficiency in large-scale production. Uniform fasteners were used throughout the aircraft, cutting down on the need for spare parts and simplifying assembly lines. Panels were kept straight with few complex curves, making them easier to shape and reducing material waste. Sub-assemblies were designed modularly, allowing wings, fuselage sections, and tail units to be constructed simultaneously and then joined with minimal adjustment, which dramatically shortened the time required for final assembly. At its peak, Boeing's Seattle facility could roll out a complete B-17 approximately every hour, a rate that astonished German observers, who were accustomed to aircraft production measured in weeks rather than hours. In contrast, German aircraft factories relied heavily on traditional craftsmanship. Components were often custom-fitted, assemblies were riveted by hand, and highly trained specialists performed most tasks. Under these methods, constructing a single bomber could take several weeks. The implications for the air war were profound. Even if German fighter units achieved favorable kill ratios, destroying 2 or 3 bombers for every fighter lost American production capacity ensured that losses were easily replaced. German industry, with its slower manufacturing pace, could not keep up. By mid-1944, the imbalance had become undeniable even to the most optimistic commanders. Victory in the air war was no longer a question of skill or tactics, but of sustaining operations against overwhelming material superiority. Captured B-17 seconds at Rechlin, including the aircraft known as Wolfhound, offered the Luftwaffe a comprehensive understanding of the Flying Fortress as a weapons system. German engineers and pilots learned its key advantages: exceptional durability, extensive defensive armament, and a payload capacity suitable for strategic bombing missions. They also identified vulnerabilities, such as the exposed nose on early models and blind spots in defensive gun coverage. Operational characteristics, range, altitude limits, and the importance of maintaining formation were carefully documented. German tacticians developed strategies that could, in theory, defeat B-17 formations when executed by experienced pilots with steady nerves. However, this tactical knowledge could not overcome the fundamental arithmetic of industrial output. For every German pilot trained to engage B-17 seconds successfully, American factories were simultaneously producing crews and aircraft at a rate that far outstripped German capacity. Each bomber destroyed in combat was replaced multiple times over, and each disrupted bombing mission was followed by even larger formations in subsequent raids. The impressive defensive firepower of the B-17 was only one part of an integrated system designed to sustain long-range strategic bombing in the face of determined opposition. The B-17 combined several features that, when deployed en masse, fundamentally transformed air warfare. Its operational range exceeded 2,000 miles, it could operate above 25,000 feet, and it carried 4,000 to 8,000 pounds of bombs depending on mission requirements. The airframe was resilient enough to withstand significant battle damage, and the defensive armament provided substantial protection for crew and payload. When hundreds of these aircraft flew in coordinated formations, mutually supporting one another, they created an aerial force capable of exerting strategic pressure deep within enemy territory. Luftwaffe General Adolf Galland, one of Germany's most accomplished fighter pilots with 104 confirmed aerial victories and later commander of German fighter forces, wrote extensively about the difficulties of countering American daylight bombing after the war. He noted that individual German pilots often had superior training and far more combat experience than American bomber crews, many of whom were flying their first missions. Advanced German aircraft, including late-war variants such as the long-nosed Tyne DD-9 and the Bf-109K-4, outperformed B-17 seconds in speed, climb rate, and maneuverability. German weaponry, particularly cannons, could inflict catastrophic damage with very few hits. Nevertheless, these advantages in technology and pilot skill were insufficient to halt the strategic bombing campaign. Galland identified several contributing factors but consistently emphasized the decisive role of American industrial capacity. The US simply produced aircraft, crews, tanks, and munitions faster than Germany could destroy them. Captured B-17 seconds provided German engineers with tangible proof of this reality. Every component was meticulously examined, disassembled, and evaluated. Each design choice was scrutinized in a level of detail that would impress even the most exacting technical investigator. In essence, the combination of standardized design, modular construction, and sheer industrial output rendered the B-17 not merely a bomber, but a system in which American strategic advantages could not be offset by superior German piloting or advanced fighter aircraft. The arithmetic of production replacing losses faster than they could be inflicted ensured that the strategic bombing campaign would continue to weaken German industry and morale, ultimately making the collapse of German resistance inevitable. German engineers and pilots who studied the American B-17 bomber found themselves deeply impressed by its design. From a purely technical standpoint, there was little in the aircraft to fault. The bomber reflected a high level of engineering sophistication, combined with exceptional manufacturing standards, and successfully integrated the latest available technologies into a unified and highly effective weapons system. In the context of a prolonged conflict, no amount of tactical ingenuity or individual pilot skill could offset such a pronounced disparity in material resources and industrial capacity. Hans-Führer Leers, a German test pilot, had the unusual opportunity to operate a wide range of captured Allied aircraft during his tenure at Rechlin and other evaluation centers. Over the course of his career, he piloted more than 125 distinct aircraft types from multiple nations, including American, British, and Soviet designs, without ever suffering a serious accident or causing damage to the planes under his care. In his post-war accounts, Leers expressed professional admiration for the technological capabilities of Allied aviation, tempered by frustration at the German industry's inability to match their production rates and organizational efficiency. Among the aircraft he tested were B-17 Flying Fortresses, B-24 Liberators, British Lancasters, Soviet P-2 bombers, and numerous fighters from all major combatant nations. Each type offered unique insights into design philosophies, operational priorities, and national approaches to aircraft engineering. Despite the breadth of his experience, the B-17 remained the most strategically important aircraft he evaluated. Unlike other bombers, the Flying Fortress embodied American doctrine of strategic bombing, translating operational principles into a tangible combination of aluminum and steel. Every design element of the B-17 was purpose-built to penetrate deep into enemy territory, deliver heavy payloads with precision through the Norden bombsight, and return to base even when confronted by determined opposition from both fighters and anti-aircraft artillery. A key factor that impressed German evaluators was the bomber's defensive armament. The interlocking fields of fire provided by multiple machine guns and well-coordinated formations enabled daylight bombing campaigns that would have otherwise been impossible. Without these defenses, unescorted bombers would have been decimated by German fighters, forcing the Americans to adopt nighttime bombing strategies similar to those employed by the British, an approach that would have significantly reduced bombing accuracy and overall effectiveness. While the B-17's defensive weapons did not make it invulnerable, nor did they prevent heavy losses, they did ensure the survival of a sufficient number of aircraft to sustain a long-term strategic campaign. Thousands of bombers were indeed shot down over Europe, but enough reached their targets to systematically degrade Germany's industrial base. Crews who survived tours of 25, later 35 missions returned home to train new pilots, amplifying the long-term impact of the campaign. Over the course of 2 years, repeated bombing raids crippled German factories, oil production facilities, transportation networks, and military manufacturing capabilities. By April 10, 1945, when the B-17 known as Wolfhound was destroyed during a raid on the Oranienburg airfield, the strategic bombing campaign had largely accomplished its objectives. German industrial centers, from the Ruhr Valley to other critical hubs, were in ruins. Shortages of fuel immobilized much of the Luftwaffe, and disrupted transportation prevented the delivery of essential supplies to front lines already facing defeat. The B-17 seconds had achieved their mission despite suffering significant casualties along the way. Captured B-17 seconds, operated by German crews, offered unique insights into Allied technology. German pilots who trained on these aircraft learned to develop attack strategies based on first-hand experience. They also gained critical skills in aircraft identification and engagement tactics that were later applied to combat operations. Additionally, these bombers occasionally supported specialized operations behind German lines, fulfilling tactical roles and aiding in pilot instruction. Throughout 1943 and 1944, captured American bombers contributed in multiple ways to the German war effort, yet they also revealed a stark truth. Germany could not compete with the sheer scale of American industrial output. Every hour German technicians spent repairing a captured B-17 represented skilled labor diverted from maintaining their own aircraft. Every gallon of fuel used, every round of ammunition expended, was material unavailable for frontline combat. Meanwhile, American factories continued to produce new bombers faster than combat could deplete them. Even decades after the war, production figures remain staggering, highlighting the industrial imbalance that ultimately determined the outcome of the air war over Europe. The story of German-operated B-17 seconds serves as a compelling footnote to the broader narrative of Allied strategic bombing. These aircraft, built in American factories, flown by American crews, then captured and repurposed by German forces, provided unparalleled insight into Allied capabilities and highlighted the futility of attempting to counter overwhelming material superiority through skill or tactics alone. They underscored a critical lesson of the conflict. In modern industrial warfare, quantity and organizational efficiency often outweigh individual expertise or battlefield ingenuity. At Boeing's Seattle facility alone, production of the B-17 bomber reached 6,981 units, spanning every variant from the initial Yoan model to the final B-17G. Douglas Aircraft contributed roughly 3,000 more from its Long Beach plants between 1942 and 1945, while Vega in Burbank added another 2,750. By the conclusion of the conflict in May 1945, total B-17 output had surpassed 12,731 aircraft. Each bomber was a marvel of engineering complexity, composed of approximately 40,000 distinct components sourced from hundreds of subcontractors across the country. These four-engine aircraft, powered by Wright Cyclone R1820 radials generating 1,200 horsepower each, contained miles of electrical wiring, thousands of pounds of shaped aluminum for structural elements, and an extensive defensive arsenal that could include up to 13 heavy machine guns, supplied with thousands of rounds of ammunition. In stark contrast, Germany never managed to produce even 2,000 heavy bombers over the course of the entire war, despite having had a more advanced aviation sector in the 1932nd and pioneering the very concept of strategic bombing. The vast disparity in outputs cannot be explained solely by factory size or industrial infrastructure. American military doctrine emphasized long-range heavy bombers capable of reaching critical strategic targets deep behind enemy lines, whereas German priorities favored medium and dive bombers designed primarily for tactical support of ground operations. A fundamental divergence in strategic philosophy. Geography also played a decisive role. The United States, shielded by oceans, could expand and operate its factories without interference, while German production constantly suffered under relentless Allied air raids that destroyed plants, killed skilled workers, and disrupted supply networks. The American education system continually produced highly trained engineers, managers, and technicians, while Germany faced a growing shortage of qualified personnel as the war progressed and casualties mounted. Beyond human resources, the U.S. political and economic system proved more flexible in mobilizing for total war, in contrast to the rigid Nazi hierarchy plagued by bureaucratic inefficiencies, internal power struggles, and ideological constraints. collectively, these factors created an industrial edge that ultimately shaped strategic outcomes. The B-17 Flying Fortress was only one component of America's extensive arsenal, but it epitomized the industrial might underlying U.S. war production. When German officers inspected captured B-17 seconds, evaluated their systems, and conducted test flights, they were not merely analyzing a single aircraft, they were witnessing the broader capacity of American industrial civilization to sustain continuous large-scale production. The lesson was clear. Defeating an opponent capable of manufacturing bombers faster than they could be shot down, training aircrews faster than losses could be inflicted, and delivering greater quantities of bombs than an entire nation's pre-war output could support was practically impossible. The defensive firepower that impressed Luftwaffe pilots was only the surface of a much deeper strategic advantage rooted in organization, resource management, and economic mobilization. The real secret weapon of the United States was not the machine guns on the B-17G, but the economic and industrial system that could simultaneously construct 12,731 bombers, 300,000 total aircraft, 88,000 tanks, 41 billion rounds of ammunition, and countless other war materials needed to fight a global conflict on multiple continents and oceans. No tactical ingenuity, skilled pilot, or heroic action could offset such overwhelming industrial supremacy. This reality led German aviators like Hans-Vera Lecher, who had flown numerous captured Allied aircraft, to recognize by 1943 that Germany's defeat was already inevitable when measured purely by production capacity. Material mathematics had made the outcome predictable, only the timing and human cost remained uncertain. Captured B-17 seconds offered the Luftwaffe valuable tactical intelligence. Blind spots in defensive coverage, vulnerable systems such as hydraulics and oxygen, and optimal attack approaches. Yet, they provided no solution to the fundamental strategic problem. How could Germany stop tens of thousands of bombers while producing only a fraction of that number of fighters each year? How could cities withstand relentless bombing when pilots were forced to fly multiple sorties daily until incapacitated or killed? How could civilian morale and industrial output endure under a continuous threat from increasingly sophisticated aerial attacks? Within the framework of Nazi Germany's military doctrine and industrial organization, there were no sorties. Factory answers. Germany had initiated a war under the assumption of swift victories before its adversaries could fully mobilize. Once this assumption proved false and the conflict became a prolonged struggle of industrial endurance, the strategic advantage shifted decisively to the Allies. The B-17 Flying Fortress, capable of sustaining catastrophic damage while continuing its mission, equipped with multiple heavy machine guns and produced in massive quantities, became a visible symbol of American industrial efficiency. Day after day, ever-increasing numbers of bombers and capable fighter escorts delivered systematic destruction to enemy targets, demonstrating conclusively that individual valor or tactical brilliance alone could not reverse the trajectory of the war. German test pilots, despite admiration for engineering and operational skill, had no choice but to acknowledge that American industrial organization had already sealed the conflict's outcome. German aviators held a grudging respect for the B-17 bomber. Its robust construction allowed it to endure damage that would have destroyed lesser aircraft, and its design clearly prioritized both crew survival and mission success. The bomber's defensive armament, capable of unleashing lethal fire in every direction, made attacking it perilous even for skilled pilots. Yet, admiration for its capabilities did little to alter the course of aerial combat over Europe. Awareness of the enemy's strengths could not compensate for a lack of the material resources required to counter them effectively. By the closing months of 1944, many B-17 seconds captured and operated by Germany had been destroyed or rendered unfit for flight. Some were destroyed during Allied bombing raids on German airfields, which increasingly targeted Luftwaffe infrastructure. Others succumbed to mechanical failures as spare parts became scarce due to disrupted supply chains. A handful continued performing specialized missions under 200 until early 1945, but by then their intelligence value had largely diminished. Years of careful study had given the Luftwaffe detailed knowledge of the flying fortress, its blind spots, system weaknesses, and the tactics that could exploit them. Nevertheless, this knowledge offered little defense against the massive Allied bombing formations, which could overwhelm defenses with sheer numbers. Individual German pilots continued to achieve notable success against B-17 formations throughout the war. Some aces downed dozens of bombers, refining their methods through both study of captured aircraft at Rechlin and combat experience. However, these exceptional performances could not offset systemic deficiencies. For every skilled pilot who survived enough missions to become proficient, many novices perished within their first 2 sorties before developing effective techniques. By 1944, the life expectancy of a German daytime fighter pilot was measured in weeks rather than months, and many never completed 10 missions before being killed or wounded. This created a continuous decline in unit experience, reinforcing a cycle of attrition that could not be broken. In contrast, American forces implemented systematic crew rotation policies. Initially, bomber crews were relieved after completing 25 missions, later extended to 35 as operational experience and survivability increased. Returning veterans were assigned to training commands, passing on knowledge gained under fire to new crews and institutionalizing lessons learned at enormous human cost. The contrast with German practice was stark. German pilots remained on combat duty until death, capture, or incapacitation, which steadily eroded overall combat proficiency. These differing policies reflected broader strategic and industrial realities. The United States could rotate experienced crews because aircraft production was continuous and new personnel could be trained to replace losses. Germany lacked this flexibility. Every pilot capable of flying a combat sortie remained on the front lines. Captured B-17 seconds did provide the Luftwaffe with valuable insights into American defensive firepower and bomber design. Yet, the lessons gained were increasingly irrelevant in the face of overwhelming Allied numerical superiority. Thousands of bombers, escorted by hundreds of fighters, could impose attrition that no tactical knowledge alone could counter. The practical experience of fighting these raids demonstrated not only the effectiveness of American tactics but also the industrial and logistical depth behind them. By the war's end in May 1945, the consequences were indisputable. Germany lay in devastation, cities reduced to rubble, industrial capacity crippled, and military forces trapped between advancing Soviet and Western Allied armies. The relentless air campaign over 2 years had achieved its objectives. The defensive firepower that impressed German pilots in 1943 allowed many B-17 seconds to survive missions despite heavy losses. Nearly 5,000 were lost during the conflict. Yet, strategic goals were met. German war industries were destroyed, transportation networks dismantled, and urban centers devastated. American factories, still capable of producing replacement aircraft at high rates, demonstrated the futility of attempting to compete in a war of industrial scale. Hans Vau, one of the Luftwaffe test pilots who flew captured B-17 seconds, survived the war and lived until 1991. He contributed extensively to documenting German test pilot experiences and evaluated both German and Allied aircraft for post-war military analysis. Vau remained proud of his technical achievements while recognizing the futility of Germany's strategic position once American industrial mobilization was fully realized. The first intact B-17 captured by Germany, codenamed Wolfhound, served from December 1942 until its destruction in April 1945. During its operational period, it provided invaluable lessons on American bomber design, defensive tactics, and production philosophy. Yet, while these lessons enhanced German understanding, they were strategically meaningless. Knowledge alone could not overcome the vast disparity in resources. The bomber's 13 machine guns symbolized not merely defensive power but also the underlying industrial philosophy of the United States. Overwhelming fire through numbers, mutual protection through formation flying, and redundancy in systems to ensure mission completion despite losses. The operational history of the B-17 in German hands underscores a broader truth: tactical insight cannot replace industrial might. The bomber formations continued to strike their targets despite German opposition, attrition, and adverse weather. German pilots acknowledged the impressive defensive coverage, long-range firepower, and ammunition supply that enabled sustained engagement. Yet these tactical features were only a manifestation of a far larger strategic reality: the United States' ability to produce, replace, and sustain combat power at a scale Germany could not match. Ultimately, the captured B-17 seconds served as silent witnesses to the broader war of industrial capacity. They taught the Luftwaffe much about American strengths, but could not alter the strategic outcome. When the last shots were fired over Europe, it was not the tactical prowess of German pilots, but the overwhelming productive capacity of the United States, the arsenal of democracy, that determined victory. The fortresses themselves, impressive as weapons, were inseparable from the industrial and organizational system that produced and supported them, a system that Germany, despite valiant effort and ingenuity, could never rival.